Welcome to another episode of Daily Devotion. Today we're looking at 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11 to 25. And today's passage is related to obeying to authorities. So let's start with the Bible reading.
Dear friends, I urge you as foreigners and exiles to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor as the supreme authority, or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the family of believers. Fear God. Honor the emperor. Slaves, in reverent fear of God, submit yourselves to your masters, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. For it is commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering, because they are conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. To this you were called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were like sheep going astray, but now you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls.
First of all, this passage talks about living an exemplary life, being a good testimony to the people in the world. So let's have a look at verse 11 and 12, and also 15, 16, 17. Starting from verse 11, Peter urges the readers to be living like foreigners once again. Like the previous verses, we are supposed to live like a temporary resident on this earth because we're living temporarily. Therefore, we do not love the world. Abstain from sinful desires, which wage war against your soul. So our sinful desire is the desire of this world that wage a war against our spiritual life, a war against our soul. So we need to abstain from our sinful desires. So that will be a good testimony if we can do that, right? And also live such good lives among the pagans. Even though they don't like you, they will accuse you, but when they see your good deeds, they will realize there is a God who actually helped you to be good like that. So they will actually bring glory to God. If we look at verse 15, for it is God's will that by doing good, you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slave. So here, we want to live as free people. At the same time, we need to live as a slave. We are freed from the law because Jesus saved us out of the law, out of the Old Testament. So as we enter into the New Testament, which is entering this new covenant with Jesus by faith, so we are actually free. We're free from the condemnation of the law. So we live as free people. However, on the other hand, do not use your freedom as cover up for evil, right? Although we're free, but it doesn't mean we can just do evil, right? It doesn't mean we can just go and do whatever we want. We can just fulfill our sinful desires. That's not the case, but we're supposed to live as God's slave. So what is God's slave? Are we free? Well, in the absolute sense, no one is free because In one of the letters of Paul, basically mentioned that we are either a slave to the world that submit to our sinful desires, or we are slave to God, to the righteousness of God. So basically, we have to choose our master. Do we choose our master to be God, or do we choose our master to be sin? And also show proper respect to everyone, love the family of believers, fear God, honor the emperor. So all of these are good deeds that as Christians we're supposed to show, we're supposed to live out in our everyday life. And we want to be a good testimony for God so that we may win some people over so that they will accept the gospel of God. This passage also talks about obeying the authorities. So let's take a moment to think about who are the authorities in our lives. If you're a student, if you're a kid, maybe your authority is your teacher, or maybe your authority is your parents. And if you're already working, maybe your authority is your employer. We also have the authority, which is the government, the law, the police. So we have lots of authorities in our lives. So the question here is that, do we obey the authorities in our lives? Let's look at verse 13. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether to the emperor or to governors. So in this verse 13 and 14, Peter talked about submitting to authorities who are doing their job in the society, who are maintaining the rights or the social orders of this world. But if we look at verse 18, Peter actually raised the bar here. Peter was telling the slaves to obey the masters, even if the masters has beaten them unfairly, right? Beat up under pain of unjust suffering. So as Christians, even if we are suffering unjustly, we're still asked to submit and obey to the authorities. And here's a reason that Peter has given. If you endure a beating for doing wrong things, right? So if you've done something wrong and you're punished, of course, you're supposed to bear up that suffering because you deserve it. But if you don't deserve the punishment and you still endure it, then that's commendable before God. Then that means God will reward you because you have been treated unfairly. And this is what we as Christians, we are asked to do. We are asked to not just obeying the authorities that are nice to us, but we're also obeying to the authorities that are mistreating us. And here's the reason that Peter is giving us, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. Because Jesus, he had committed no sin, but he suffered humiliation and death, and he took upon himself all the sins of this world. That is the love and grace Jesus has shown us. So this is why we as followers of Christ, we are supposed to follow Jesus' example and learn to sacrifice ourselves for the sake of loving other people and reveal to this world that there is this source of love, this source of grace coming out from us, which ultimately come from Jesus. So this is why when we are being mistreated, we still learn to bear up the punishment, bear up that mistreatment, and not retaliate, right? Here it says, when they hurled their insults at Jesus, he did not retaliate. He did not deserve this punishment, but he did not take things into his own hands, and he made no threats. Instead, he entrusts himself to him who judges justly, which is God, right? He entrusts himself to God who judges justly. It is God who judges things justly. It is not us. Therefore, we shouldn't take things into our hands. So let us leave things to God to judge. And here I just like to mention an example. I want to illustrate that we need to exercise some discernment and wisdom in applying this obedience. So let's think about the example of the midwife in Exodus, where Pharaoh asked the midwife to kill every single boy that was born so that the population of Israel can be controlled. But because the midwife feared God, she did not blatantly obey Pharaoh, but instead she kept those boys alive, and God rewarded her. Why did God reward the midwife? why didn't God require the midwife to obey, right? Aren't we called to obey all the authorities? Well, God is our ultimate authority. If there is a conflict between obeying God and obeying human authority, we always choose to obey God instead. Because if we disobey God and obey human authority, then terrible things can happen, right? We don't want to go and kill people and say, well, I'm just being taught by God to obey all the authorities. But in reality, no, because God also told us not to kill, right? Not to do bad things. So this is where we need to exercise some caution and discernment in obeying to authority. In this case, Peter is more talking about when we are being mistreated, when we are wronged by the authority. That's when we can take some self-sacrifice. But we never want to sacrifice other people, right? We never want to do bad things against other people in order to obey the authority. The other thing is many of us live in a democratic society, for example, in the US or in the Europe, in Australia. You know, as we live in a democratic society, do we submit to the authority? Well, of course, we need to obey the laws. That is the authority we have to submit to. But on the other hand, maybe the government is not doing things for the best interest of the citizens. And in that case, we may want to make some arguments against the government because we living in a democratic society, we have the right, we have the free speech to speak out against the unjust and unrighteous things happening in our countries. So this is when I would say we shouldn't just blatantly obey the authority, but rather we need to be a changing agent in our society and be the light and salt of this world to speak up and to go against the unrighteous and evil things happening in this world. Obeying the authority does not necessarily mean agreeing with the authority. So we have to make that clear distinction. When we have the opportunity to legally to express our disagreement with the authority, I think we should do that when things are against God's will. But if obeying the authority does not compromise our relationship with God, does not compromise God's intention and will, then we should obey the authority. Finally, I just want to point out that we are not alone because Jesus has set an example of suffering and bearing this unjust punishment on himself so that he can reveal to the world his love and the grace of God. So let us also follow Jesus' footsteps and do the same.